Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm your host, Karan Takhar, and today I'm joined by Mike Kramer, Vice President of Data Economy Strategy at Constellation. As the AI boom takes shape, the demand on data centers to have 24/7 reliable power is increasing. On this episode, we discuss how nuclear power could be part of the solution to increasing the supply. Mike and I discuss how nuclear has evolved over the past few decades, where it is today, as well as why it hasn't taken off in the ways some hoped it would. We chat about the trajectory of AI-related energy demand, how the recent tax bill could affect nuclear power, which is like to know this conversation was recorded as the House was debating its version of the bill, and what excites Mike most about Constellation's role in shaping the future of clean energy in the US. If you're curious about where we might get the energy needed to power the latest AI breakthroughs, this is the episode for you. I learned so much speaking with Mike, and I know you will too. Please enjoy my conversation with Mike Kramer. Hello, Mike. Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. It is incredible to have you on. Really appreciate you taking the time. Looking forward to diving into your journey and your work at Constellation. There's a lot happening in the energy sector right now, so really exciting times, and have a decent amount of questions that I'm super excited to hear your perspective on. And to kick things off, could you just share a little bit about your unique journey into energy and technology strategy? Can you share a bit about your background and how it led to your current role at Constellation?
Sure, Karan, and thanks for having me on the podcast. Looking forward to the discussion. It has been a relatively unique journey. If you compare my background to a number of your other podcast guests, I think you see something different. My original background was in accounting. I started my career in public accounting and moved to what was then Exelon just over 20 years ago with no energy background whatsoever. So I came in really with a finance and accounting type background. And really what has led me to this role today is 20 years of broad finance experience within the energy industry in Exelon and Constellation, but also a focus on a variety of different special projects and a specific expertise in nuclear. So Constellation, largest generator of nuclear energy in the country, given our scale in nuclear, doing some operational finance activities at our fleet made me the subject matter expert on all things nuclear evaluation. And that led me to do a bunch of valuation work on growth projects when we separated Constellation from Exelon. A lot of those projects were looking at the best ways to optimize our nuclear generation. So looking at potential plant acquisitions like we did with South Texas project, looking at restarts of shutdown reactors like we did with the Crane Clean Energy Center. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. And then other ways to optimize the benefits of the clean and reliable megawatts that come from Constellation. So that was a pretty natural fit to use that background to think about how do we strategize around the data economy. And so my role is the Vice President of Data Economy Strategy and looking at ways in which we can help power data center customers and kind of the overall trends that are happening in that industry.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you for providing that insights. And we will be getting to AI and data centers and also diving deeply into nuclear throughout this conversation. And a couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to attend CERAWeek. And one of the differences between CERAWeek this year, which is a major energy conference for those listeners who might not be super familiar, is that for the first time, the big tech companies came out in force. And it's clear that the dynamics are sort of shifting where now these major tech companies with huge capital investment abilities are really trying to focus more on how they can contract supply, which we are going to dive a little bit into. But first, want to just set the grounding for how nuclear has evolved over the last couple of decades since you started working at Exelon and now Constellation. Could you provide a little bit of an overview of where nuclear was when you first started and where you feel like it is today?
Yeah, it's been quite the journey for nuclear over the 20 years that I've been at the company. Starting in the mid 2000s, uh, nuclear was pretty popular. It was one of those too cheap to meter. We were seeing high power prices. There was some interest in new build, and then the 2008 financial crisis happened. A lot of those new build projects got canceled. There was the subsequent event at Fukushima, and there was definitely a change or a shift in terms of the interest in new nuclear, as well as the support that existed for the existing fleet. We've been working very diligently at Constellation to make sure that we didn't lose a lot of the existing fleet. We had a bunch of state programs in New York and in Illinois and in New Jersey to help support those assets and prevent them from shutting down. We did see a couple of the plants shut down. So Oyster Creek and 3 Mile Island were two examples of that happening in the late 2010s. And then there was a pretty big momentum shift. And I think you saw that with the congressional legislation in the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan support that we've been seeing from policymakers for both existing and new nuclear, and the 45U PTC that helps protect the existing units. And so with that, there's definitely been, I'd say, a momentum shift. Then you add in the data economy transformation and the interest and the sustainability goals from the hyperscalers, and you see an additional, I'd say, pickup in the views on nuclear. Public momentum, companies supporting, legislators are in backing new nuclear and existing nuclear. And so you get a lot of the same benefits from where we're at today that I think will help kind of drive the industry into the future for the next 20 years.
And also, we're seeing quite a lot of evolution in the technology of nuclear, where now you can essentially build these very small modular reactors, or not maybe in the current moment, but in the relatively near future. Are you seeing nuclear technology evolve in a way that makes it more viable today than maybe 10 years ago when 3 Mile Island was shut down?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of key points there, Karan. The first is, in order for new nuclear to work, you really need to get the technology from first of a kind to nth of a kind as fast as you can. And I think there are a couple of ways in which that's happening right now. The first is as it relates to the large nuclear units. We saw the two that came online in Georgia at Vogtle. And so you have two AP1000s, you have some history, you have the benefits of seeing Unit 4 come in considerably less than Unit 3, and others that are looking at potentially doing follow-on builds as it relates to the AP1000s. For the small ones, you see some companies like the Googles and the Amazons of the world start to invest in some of the new technologies that can potentially scale because they're building 4-packs of them. And so you can do 4 at a time, or 4 plus 4. It gets you pretty quickly down that cost curve from that first of a kind build to the nth of a kind build. That's really what we're looking for at Constellation. We're looking to support those technologies, make sure that there's the infrastructure and the technology support in place for us to do that. And we see new nuclear as a key beneficiary to the data economy.
So just continuing on this thread for a little longer, and then again, we're definitely going to be diving deeply into the data economy. So why, from your perspective, do you feel like nuclear has not taken off to the same levels that maybe some have been hoping for it to, in the sense that nuclear has been around for decades now, and it is clean power, it's firm power, and therefore there's a lot of potential for nuclear technology to really create a transformational impact in the world, really. But it seems as if nuclear as an energy source has relatively remained stable in its supply over like several decades now. You mentioned costs, you mentioned Fukushima, so public perception, but could you just walk us through like what you would boil down the key nuclear issue to be today? And if we were able to unlock that, then nuclear can just take off.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things there. The first is what I said before on getting from the first of a kind to nth of a kind. It's hard with developing technologies to get to scale, and you need to see that first one get built and multiple come shortly thereafter to really move its way down the cost curve, give people certainty, allow for additional financing. So I think that's one of the answers. But part of the reason for that taking a lot of time, Karan, is one, you've got regulatory regimes that take a long time to get through the process. So right now, there's only one small modular reactor that's been fully through the licensing process in the U.S. You have the AP1000 that's through that process as well. But there are several other technologies that are in that pipeline that are working their way through that process, and it takes a lot of time. So that's the first thing, is you get a little bit of a time lag that comes from the regulatory process.
How long, roughly, did that first of a kind project take to get through that process? Because I think it's a really important point, because with time, more time comes added costs. So there are a lot of important elements that stem directly from the amount of time it takes to go through a regulatory regime.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the how long those went through the process, because I haven't been part of those projects. But I'd say the way to think about it is there are a number of elements that have to go into the regulatory process. You have to get the site permitted. You have to make sure that the technology has gone through that rigorous review by the NRC. And so there's a couple different steps that can take years. I would say that the NRC's been making improvements. The administration is certainly pushing very hard to make sure that they can get new nuclear built. And so as part of that, we expect that regulatory review timeline would shrink. But to what extent, I think it's hard to say at this point.
What were some of the other elements?
So the regulatory timeline is one of them. The second is we don't have market designs that are for 60-year, 80-year, 100-year type assets. So a lot of the competitive markets that we have today, you can sell power ahead 3 years, maybe 5 years. In some cases, you can do a PPA for 10 or 20. But we're really talking about building long-lived assets that have 60-plus year service lives. And so without some offtake certainty in terms of the revenues, it becomes pretty challenging to make the math work for financing, for construction risk, all those things that you would be taking on as a developer. And so we're trying to figure out some of those solutions, right? Is there a way to cover some cost overrun risk or share that with a variety of different parties, public and private? Are there other ways in which you can get an off-taker for an extended period of time at a cost or a price that makes sense for that math to work? Can you build a consortium of folks that help share some of that first of a kind risk so you can get to nth of a kind faster? So I think the industry is thinking through the benefits and the ways in which you can get down that curve faster, but that's really been the driver. I mean, if you think about what happened in 2008, there were a bunch of new build projects in the pipeline, and then power prices went from $90 to $30. And so if you're thinking about, as a construction of a new plant and you don't have that revenue certainty and it's sitting at $30, it's pretty tough to make the math work on a new build that probably costs you $100 plus today.
That makes a lot of sense, which is a nice segue into the demand for electricity, which will come from AI and electrification more broadly. So we're seeing headlines daily, almost, it feels, about data centers and AI training sucking up huge amounts of power. How does Constellation view the trajectory of AI-related energy demand over the next decade?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that there's some significant demand from the data economy coming. But I would caveat it and say that I don't think it's at the levels that some are predicting, and what you see a lot of the news stories about the tens and 20s and hundreds of gigawatts that are coming on immediately. I think we've seen a lot, Karan, in our work where we know from our conversations that there are projects that are being proposed in multiple jurisdictions across the country, which is leading to some double counting in those utility forecasts. We also know that there's a prerequisite for a lot of these speculative developers that are looking to build data centers that they need to have a power ready date. And so to get a power ready date, you have to go through the process and get a utility service request put in. And when that happens, you get counted. And so you end up seeing a lot of these utility calculations on their load forecasts at pretty crazy levels because a lot of those projects aren't real. So I think it's a combination of, we know the data economy is transformative. We know there's going to be a lot of demand growth. I mean, if you think about the size of data centers now versus where they were a couple of years ago, the typical data center 2 to 3 years ago was being 10 megawatts, maybe smaller in some cases. And now you're seeing some in the 50 to 100 megawatt range, and a lot that are starting to talk about being under construction for the 500 megawatt to gigawatt scale. And so you can see from that sizing that there will be considerably more demand. But I think the way in which some people are taking that to the extreme is clearly overstated.
So you're a believer, it seems, that some of it is hype. There's a lot of hype in the AI world.
It's not so much hype, because I'm not saying there's not a lot of AI demand. I think what happens is the process results in a lot of, I'd say, speculative development in different regions that will likely not show up. And an example I'll give you is like in ERCOT, they've updated their load forecast to do a couple things. They, one, took historical information from 22 to 24 and said, all right, these things typically get delayed. An average delay is 9 months. And so they took down their load forecast for an assumption around delays. There's also a number of them that don't show up. And so it was about a 50% haircut based on their 2 years worth of it, or 3 years worth of experience in the past of projects that had entered the queue, said that they were going to come, and then didn't show up. And so I think there are a bunch of examples of that where it's not that there isn't a lot of AI demand. And I think if you look at the CapEx from the hyperscalers, the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Googles, if they're spending $50 to $100 billion to build their own data centers, I think that there's a lot of demand out there, but it isn't to the extent that I think some of the higher forecasts are showing.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, for me, it just seems like the AI use cases today are very early in its adoption. So it's extremely hard to project demand out, because on one hand, we don't even really know where the AI use cases are headed. And like that will directly dictate. One crazy stat that I recently heard from the AI czar, David Sachs, is actually the czar of AI and crypto under the current administration. He was talking about how there are 3 key variables that dictate how efficient / useful of a technology AI will be. And the first is the algorithm, the second is the compute, and then the third is the data center. And he was saying how each of these variables are increasing at a 3x rate annually. And if you do the math there, that means in 4 years, 4.2 years, AI will be a million times better than it is today, because each of those 3 factors are increasing at a rate of 3x annually, which that kind of blew my mind. I was like, wow, this thing is, who knows where it's headed.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to pull out there. The first is, when you think about data center growth in general, it's not all going to be from AI. So we know there's going to be data centers that do cloud, there's data centers for enterprises. And if you look at just the trajectory on some of those over the last couple of years, that's been relatively significant. I know that some of the labs have put out reports in terms of the breakout of what the data center build looks like. And those are not insignificant parts of the growth story as it relates to data centers. And then the second thing is, you mentioned the AI use cases. I think part of the reason why time to power is very important to the hyperscalers is getting to scale and understanding exactly what these models are capable of and how quickly they can get that there is a big part of the business case. And so that's part of the reason why I think it's really important that we get these data centers built quickly and have the power solutions for them, because that will allow us to win the AI race, both from an economic transformation standpoint, but then also for national security purposes.
100%. 100%. So where do you feel like that power supply will be largely coming from? Let's segment it into two buckets, maybe up until 2030 and then post 2030.
Yeah, it's good to break it up into those two buckets, because I think what you're seeing in the market right now is it's difficult to get new build on very quickly. You've got backlogs on turbines, you've got long lead parts with transformers and other things that will make it very difficult to do some of those new build. You've got the generation queue that takes a lot of effort to get through. And I think all of those are progressing. Like PJM, for example, has their reliability resource initiative where they're trying to get some new resources on faster, and that will get more generation on in the 27, 28, 29 timeframe than what would have otherwise been there. So I don't want to say that as in we won't see new resources, because I think we will. But there's a couple of things that are important in this next 3 to 5 years. I think the first is when you think about the best ways to power data centers, given their relatively close to 24/7 use case, you really want firm resources to do that. Nuclear being the best, in my opinion, not just because Constellation's a big nuclear provider, but because if you think about both the clean and reliable attributes that nuclear can provide, that's obviously a big beneficiary to the data centers. And so they're thinking about that. And I think the other things to think about for nuclear as a means to serve the data center load is a lot of the existing nuclear assets are coming up on their licensing lives. And so if you can come up with ways in which you can take care of those existing assets for another 10, 15, 20 years, you allow them to continue operating on the system. So when you think about, keeping those units around, making sure we have the carbon-free benefits that they provide, that's one of the things. The second is there are some ways to add new nuclear in the near term. So I mentioned at the beginning about the restart of 3 Mile Island as the Crane Clean Energy Center. That's 835 megawatts that's coming on by 2028. And so you know that you're going to have a pretty significant adder in the Pennsylvania region for that. We also have talked about uprates to the existing fleet. And so you can add about a gigawatt to our existing fleet and uprates. And so that is another example where you don't necessarily need to have new build. They can get through faster and support some of these data center customers.
Is that Constellation's existing fleet, or is that nuclear?
No, that's Constellation's existing fleet. There are other uprates across the U.S. That a number of other power generators have talked about doing or are in the process of doing.
Do you have a sense of how much nuclear capacity there is that currently exists in the U.S. that could be upgraded without requiring a new build?
It varies. So it's one of those hard answers because it's very technical. But the way to think about it is, one, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So you can't do the same thing to every plant and get the same amount of megawatts. So that's difficult. And then the second is a number of them have already been uprated over time. And so you see a bunch of plants that have already gone through some of the larger ones, a couple or a number of them that have gone through some of the smaller ones. And so even within our fleet, that 1,000 megawatts that I said is a variety of different sizes, timelines, locations. And so it's not as simple of an answer as every unit can get an extra 50 or 100 megawatts out of it. The scale of them can vary from 10 megawatts to a couple hundred.
I'm just curious to put this into a sizing. Would you say it's over 10 gigawatts or less than?
It should be less than 10 gigawatts.
Okay.
I mean, if you think about us as the largest nuclear operator and we have about a gigawatt. There's that. I think some of it too, Karan, comes down to economics. And so, what do the tax credits look like? How does that process play out? What is the customer willing to pay? And how does that play out? Because there could be some that are out there that are just prohibitively expensive. And so if you start changing the economic equation on them, maybe you can add to that number, but I don't think it's going to be 10 gigawatts. No.
Got it. Thanks.
So, and then there will be some other resources that get used that aren't nuclear, obviously. Those types of deals are already happening. So that's both existing and new gas and other. I think you'll see a lot of different solutions. And a lot of this, when you think about the near term, is the best way to optimize the system, right? So right now there's excess capacity on the system. There's a Duke study that was put out by Tyler Norris a couple months ago, and you've probably heard some of the details there, but maybe your listeners haven't. I think the way to think about that one is they did a study that showed that a lot of the existing resources don't get used often. We have a system that's built for peak. And an example of that would be in PJM, where a lot of our generation is. We hit 65% of the capacity 20% of the time. And really don't get to the peak amount. You hit 90% of the peak 2% of the time. So there's plenty of excess capacity on the system. You got to figure out ways to avoid those peak hours. And so in that study, it said if you could curtail 0.25% of the time, which is somewhere around 25 hours or so a year, you'd be able to put 76 gigawatts on the system. And so that's pretty significant if you think about the amount of load that's out there and some of these forecasts. If you could get that much load on there and not have any sort of reliability challenges, it would be great. Obviously, you need to figure out how to manage that flexibility. There's a number of things that are happening right now for people to be able to do that. The one that I'd highlight for you, just so you know, is there's a program that EPRI is running called DC Flex. And, you mentioned CERAWeek. That was what the panel I was on at CERAWeek was about. And it's a collaboration between hyperscalers, utilities, power generations, some other companies that have electric solutions, trying to figure out how we can make the data centers more flexible, what other flexibility options are there to load forecasting, other ways in which you can potentially shave those peaks and make it so that you don't have any of those reliability challenges in those peak hours.
I found it super fascinating where, as you said, there is a lot of excess capacity on the grid because the grid is built in a way that the supply has to be able to cover the peak demand, not necessarily the demand on a general day. And as a result, there's 76 gigawatts of excess capacity with that 0.25% margin, which is just very small. I mean, as in like these data centers, again, another misconception that I had, don't need to operate 24/7. So like only shutting or like not consuming electricity for 0.25% of the time should be a very reasonable ask. But I think he was saying that this is only phase one of the research. Now he's going to dive into how exactly that excess supply is divided up regionally and like whether it is actually feasible for some of these data centers to site in these areas. But I thought it was a really interesting study.
Yeah, they definitely did not take into consideration certain locational specific transmission constraints. And so they are looking at that as part of their next phase. And I think if you think about, this is a very location specific challenge that we're talking about. Where you site these data centers, how much power and transmission exists on that part of the system is important. One of the reasons we've been advocating for the benefits of co-location is if you site a data center very close or next to the generator, you solve for some of those problems. You don't need additional system upgrades. There is excess capacity largely in those locations because they have the generation already there. And so you end up with those types of benefits. But that's not a one size fits all, because you could see examples where if you're in a zone where they're building 10 gigawatts of data centers, putting one up and next to a generator doesn't necessarily change the fact that there's 10 gigawatts that you have to figure out how you're going to serve.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So how does the current partnership with Exelon work? Is Constellation a completely separate entity these days? Because I'm curious to hear from the perspective of like how utilities are thinking of onboarding or meeting this excess load, which I mean, it seems like there are many options, but also will be a pretty big challenge because the severe implications, like you mentioned on the national security side, where, for example, China, a recent stat that I read in terms of their load growth is that they're expecting to increase supply from 3 terawatts to 8 terawatts in the coming, I think, until 2040, whereas I think the same report mentioned that U.S. is 1 to 2 terawatts. So they'll have a lot more electricity supply. And as AI becomes more commoditized, it really might come down to the cost of energy. So just curious. So it is severe challenge on the national security side as well. Also, when you think about the applications in defense, but yeah, I would love to hear your take here.
So to the first part of your question, Constellation is completely separate from Exelon. Used to be part of the same company, but the two companies separated back in 2022. So Exelon retained the transmission and distribution businesses. Constellation is a generation company that serves 10% of the carbon-free power across the country, and has a large commercial business that serves 3/4 of the Fortune 100. So really a generation and wholesale retail power provider is the best way to think about what Constellation does. So we play a big role in how the power gets generated. The utilities in the front of the meter applications are the ones who are hooking up a lot of these customers. And so if you think about it from their perspective, there's a couple things. I don't want to talk specifics about it, Exelon as it relates to their interests, because I'll let them do that. But generally, the utilities are looking to get load on their system because it allows them to have that load growth for revenue purposes, and then also generally leads to some level of system upgrades that they can rate base. And so they're financially incentivized to put load on the system. But what they don't do in the competitive markets is control the supply element. And so for a lot of that, they need to understand the system dynamics of what putting the load on the system does. So they do those studies that I mentioned earlier, and that helps determine the timelines they think that they can get those large loads interconnected. What you're seeing in a couple examples of, I'd say, the big clusters, the Dominions and the AEPs of the world, is they're getting to the point where it's difficult to put new customers on quickly without additional supply or additional transmission. And so they're working through how that process works. But in the interim, their interconnection queue starts to get a bit of a backlog, and you can see some of those timelines push out. That kind of gets you back to what we were talking about earlier, which is a lot of these companies are going to be looking for the place they can come on the fastest. And so trying to get interconnected in a couple different areas, figure out which one works the best. And that's the project that's most likely to go through, and the other ones will likely fall out of the queue in that case. What the utilities are trying to avoid is stranded infrastructure. What they don't want to have to do is build for a gigawatt data center that doesn't show up, because that puts all their customers at risk. So they're trying to come up with ways in which they can avoid that, whether it's by putting some of the folks that are in the queue with some more financial hooks on their development requirements, or just making sure that they have more line of sight in terms of what their projects are before they get them interconnected.
Makes a lot of sense. Wow, we only have 5 minutes to go, so I might rapid fire a few questions.
Yeah, no problem.
And would like to circle back and just put a bow on the nuclear discussion, because I know a lot of people are specifically interested in this topic. And once they see that you were on the podcast, their mind's going to be blown. And again, really grateful that you're taking the time. So say if you had the opportunity to speak to the current administration, specifically the team that is working to help fast track nuclear projects here in the US. What are some things that you would specifically point them to be like, here are the areas we've been struggling. Here's where we need your support. Can you please provide some insight into specific things that are top of mind that you feel could be beneficial to advancing nuclear here in the US?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because there's obviously a lot of factors that go into the ability to build a new plant, kind of what we talked about earlier. But I'd say there's a couple. The first is the policy uncertainty as it relates to tax credits, policy support. I think those things are challenging. If you're in in any of these types of technologies looking to build new, and you don't understand the economics because they're dependent on things that can move around on you, that policy uncertainty is very difficult to make investment decisions. And so I think that would be priority number one, is making sure that there's a clear policy framework that's not likely to move around, so that you can count on whether it's tax credits, loan program office support, permitting rules, regulatory requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's probably the most important. I think there's a lot of specifics we could get into as it relates to, how to make sure that there's the right level of risk sharing and, making sure that these technologies, we pick ones that we can get from first of a kind to nth of a kind faster, and not have, 100 first of a kinds that don't ever get a second one built. So there's a couple of those types of elements that I think would be important as we move this forward, but the policy certainty is the most important thing from my perspective.
How does the recent tax bill look for nuclear?
So there is bipartisan support for nuclear in both the House and the Senate. The bill out of Ways and Means did have some changes to the tax credits. It has 45U phasing out, which it didn't before. And then 45Y also phases out. That's the tech neutral credit that would apply to the new builds, the uprates, et cetera. And so we're hopeful that those change.
Do you feel like there are any things that the government could do to ease up that process?
Yeah, so I don't know that that's a government issue per se. The way I look at it, and we didn't talk about this, but I think it's important, is one of the benefits of new build at existing sites is you get a lot of that taken care of. You already have community support. If you look at the folks around our existing plants, very supportive. Any of the surveys you're looking at, people who advocate for nuclear, the ones closest to the plants are huge advocates of the facilities, and they bring a huge amount of tax revenue. They employ a large amount of workers. And so you get a lot of local support and community support from that. You also have the infrastructure in place because you've already got the electrical infrastructure, the water, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly is the skilled workforce. So you already have, operators and engineers and those folks that work at the existing facilities. And so the synergies that are associated with doing that, keeping the existing around so that you can build new in those same locations, is really one of the ways to help expedite those challenges. And so we see that as a big advantage for where you should site nuclear, and it kind of solves one of the problems that you mentioned.
Well, Mike, thank you for an incredible conversation. I have one final question, and really appreciate all the insight you've shared. I know a lot of people will likely learn a lot from this conversation, as I certainly have. Looking ahead, what excites you most about Constellation's role in shaping the future of clean energy in the US? Are there any big bets, technologies, or transitions on the horizon that we might not have discussed and that you think people aren't paying enough attention to yet?
Yeah, so we talked to the benefits of nuclear. I think there's definitely a lot there that I'm excited about. It's in my background, it's certainly one of our key areas of competitiveness for Constellation. But we didn't talk about the Calpine acquisition. And so Constellation, in the process of acquiring Calpine, one of the largest gas generators in the country, And so you end up with a combined company once we close, where you not just have the benefits of nuclear, but Calpine's a leader in carbon capture technology and what they're working through there. They have a large geothermal plant. And so you get the benefits of having geothermal as part of the portfolio. And then they have a battery storage program. And so thinking through the ways in which you combine the different solutions that gets you a bunch of carbon-free benefits across a wide geographic region is pretty exciting as you think about not just Constellation alone, but the combination of Constellation and Calpine together.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mike, again, for taking the time. Really appreciate this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.